The first time Jeremiah Stone laid eyes on her, she was kneeling in the ashes of a burned-out chapel, her dress torn near the hem, her hair matted with soot and blood, and her hands raw from digging, bare-fisted through rubble. No one had asked her to, and no one else was helping, but she kept clawing at the ruin like she meant to pull a whole town back from the dead. He didn't speak to her then, didn't approach. Just stood in the hard winter light beyond the skeleton frame of the church, his horse shifting uneasily beneath him. Smoke still clung to the ground like a low fog, stinging his nose with the sour stink of burnt timber and flesh. He watched her until her hands stilled and her shoulders began to shake. Then he turned his horse back toward the trail. They crossed paths again 2 days later at a trading post called Haven's Hollow, a place that sounded kinder than it was. She sat silent near the stove, shivering in a blanket too thin for the season. The storekeep, a drunk widow with a loaded shotgun under the counter, gave Jeremiah a narrow glance as he entered but said nothing. The woman didn't lift her head. He bought salt, coffee, shot, and jerky. On a breath he didn't plan to use, he asked, "What happened in Bellmare?" The woman by the stove flinched, just slightly. The widow spat into a dented pail and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Same thing that happens most places. Somebody came wanting what wasn't theirs, took it, burned the rest." Jeremiah said nothing. He left the goods on the counter and turned to go. Then he heard her voice, small and rasped from smoke. "There was a girl under the choir floor, little one. I almost had her hand." He turned, her face was gaunt, eyes rimmed red and hollow. "She was singing when they came. That's how I knew she was still alive." "Did she make it?" he asked. "No," she said, and it was a plain thing, like naming the weather. "But I stayed until I stopped hearing her, just in case." That night snow fell soundless and steady over the hollow, softening the edge of the world. Jeremiah made camp outside town, as he always did. He didn't trust walls nor the men who built them. His fire crackled low, its light barely enough to see by. He sat watching the flames as though they held answers. They never had. She came to him near midnight, coatless, holding nothing but a small cloth satchel. Her breath showed sharp in the dark. "You got room?" she asked. He studied her, not young, not old, worn like him. Hands red from cold, still caked with black under the nails. For what? For a body that won't lie still. He didn't ask more, just nodded once, and she crouched by the fire, not touching him, not speaking, just there. Like a wild thing too tired to run anymore. Her name, he learned 3 days later, was Mara. They rode together without talking much. She was quiet but not skittish. She knew how to sleep on the ground and keep watch without spooking. She tied her hair back with twine, never complained about the cold, and when they ran short on food, she gave up her portion without being asked. They traveled through the snow-bitten flats of Dustwater, skirting towns and settlements. They moved like ghosts, unwelcome, unnoticed, necessary. Some nights she sang low, wordless tunes that seemed older than the ground they walked on. Her voice was cracked but sure, like wind through dead leaves. On the 5th night, Jeremiah woke from a dream of fire and weeping. The stars were sharp overhead. She sat across the embers, knees drawn up, staring into nothing. "You were in Bellmare?" he asked. "I was passing through, thought to rest a spell, helped the children at the chapel during the day, washed linens, told stories." "What happened?" "They came at dusk, riders, not bandits, not soldiers. Just men with dead eyes. They locked the chapel, then lit it, said it was to make the rest of the town bend, said they'd only burn one place." Jeremiah didn't speak. He knew that kind of fire, strategic, cruel, cowardly. "I went back after. When they'd gone, dug for them, couldn't stop." "You did more than most would," he said. "I didn't do enough," she said, her voice thickening. "Not nearly." In the weeks that followed, they passed through lands blighted by drought and war, where cattle lay sun-bleached and ribbed in the fields and fences fell under their own weight. Jeremiah fixed wagons for broken families, lent his rifle when wolves circled too close to the firelight. Mara sat with the sick, made broth when she could, held the hands of the dying. Word of what happened in Bellmare followed them, whispered like a bad wind. Folk looked at Mara like she was marked. She didn't flinch, didn't explain, just stayed close to the fire and kept moving. Jeremiah began to understand her rhythm. when she needed silence, when she'd drift from camp at dusk, barefoot in the snow, to walk the edge of the trees. He didn't follow, just waited for her to return. They never spoke of where they were going. It was enough that they weren't staying. She had a map folded into the lining of her satchel, but it had no names on it, just black ink lines and notations in a language he didn't know. He never asked. He figured whatever road she was on started long before he met her. But there was a change coming. He felt it one morning when he found her staring west, lips parted like she'd heard a sound only she could hear. "You ever been through Hellwater?" she asked. Jeremiah stilled. The name wasn't spoken lightly. Hellwater was no place. It was a stretch of desert that swallowed men whole, a place of salt flats and sinkholes where the wind never stopped and the sun peeled skin like bark. "You crossed Hellwater only if you had no other way." "I have," he said. "I need to go back," she said. "Something of mine still there." He didn't ask what. He just nodded. When they rode out that morning, the sky was iron gray and the wind carried the bite of storms to come. Mara didn't look back, and Jeremiah knew then that whatever lay ahead, it would be the test of them both. Not all pilgrimages were for redemption. Some were for reckoning. They entered the mouth of Hellwater at dawn, where the mesquite grew low and stubborn, and the light took on a bleached quality, as if the land itself refused to hold color. The soil turned from ochre to bone-white, cracked into 1,000 veins that whispered as the wind licked through. Nothing sang here, no birds, no insects, only the scrape of hooves and the faint, steady creak of leather. Jeremiah didn't speak unless she did. He knew better than to fill silence meant for memory. Mara rode like a woman returning to something left unfinished, her spine straight, her eyes narrowed against the light. She had tied her hair up beneath a faded kerchief, but strands whipped loose, catching in her lashes. She looked forward always, as if afraid turning back would break her. They camped beneath the ribs of a stone bluff the first night, fireless. Too many eyes in Hellwater, too many things that moved in the dark and didn't blink. Jeremiah laid their bedrolls apart, but she shifted closer sometime in the night. He felt her breath on his shoulder before sleep claimed him. By the third day, the world had thinned to heat and thirst. Their canteens were near empty, lips cracked, tongues thick. The horses grew wild-eyed, swishing at phantoms with their tails. Jeremiah spoke at last. "We need to find the old well at Cinder Hollow, if it hasn't gone dry." Mara nodded. "I remember the path. There's a cairn shaped like a woman kneeling. That's where we turn north." He studied her from under the brim of his hat. "You came through before." "I was brought through," she said, "years back, when I was still young enough to think surviving was the same as living." They found the cairn at dusk. The kneeling stones had slumped, wind-worn and half-buried in sand, but Mara knew it at once. She dismounted and brushed her fingers across its shoulder, like greeting an old sentinel. They found Cinder Hollow in darkness. The wind had heaped the sand high, half-burying the remnants of cabins. A rusted bell hung crooked from a leaning post. There were no bones, no signs of life, only the echo of something lost. Jeremiah uncovered the well with care, clearing the stones one by one. At the bottom there was water, brackish, but still clean enough to save them. They drank without speaking. Mara kept her hands wrapped around the tin cup long after it was empty. "This is where they brought us," she said quietly. "After the raiders hit our wagon train, we were just girls, some of us." Jeremiah didn't interrupt. "They sold us to a man who lived in the rocks beyond here, said we were lucky. He didn't beat us like the others, just wanted silence. Said silence was holy." Her voice didn't tremble, it had gone cold. "One night I slit his throat while he slept, took his horse and what food I could carry. I left the door open so the others could follow, but they didn't. Or couldn't." She looked toward the west, where Hellwater spread like a bruise across the earth. "I don't know who made it. I don't know if I did." Jeremiah crouched beside the fire pit. "You made it," he said low. She didn't answer. The next days blurred together in a blur of heat and distance. They passed through ravines where the sun never reached, over salt flats that burned white in the midday glare. Mara barely slept. She walked ahead most mornings, tracing a path no longer visible. Once they came upon a skeleton, human, half buried in the sand with its hand outstretched, a child's toy clenched between bone fingers. Mara knelt and buried it with her bare hands. No words. They encountered no one living until the sixth day, when they crested a rise and saw smoke curling from a distant cleft in the rocks. Jeremiah reached for his rifle. "That ain't cookfire smoke." "No," Mara said, "that's a forge." They approached with caution, weaving between the crags. At the base of a cliff stood a crude structure, stone walls blackened by soot, iron bars across the only window. A forge, yes, and more. A prison once. A man stepped out to meet them. Grizzled, thin as wire, one eye clouded, he wore a blacksmith's apron and a pistol on his hip. "Well, I'll be," he drawled. Mara weighed. "Thought you were long dead." Mara stood still, her hands at her sides. "You know me?" she asked. He spat into the dust. "I was here when you ran, one of the guards. Didn't reckon you'd come back to hell just to see me." "I came back to bury the bones," she said. "All of them." The man laughed, but it caught rough in his throat. "Ain't nothing left here but smoke and ghosts." "Then I'll bury them too." Jeremiah stepped forward. "You alone here?" "Been 10 years since anyone else passed through." "I stay because no one else will. Someone gotta keep the door shut." "What door?" Mara asked. The man turned and pointed to a slab of stone, half hidden by brush. It bore carvings, old, worn, not of this country. "They built it over the mine," he said. "Back when the place ran silver. Said there were things down there that whispered in the dark. Said they drove men mad." Mara stepped closer. Her face was pale. "He made us sleep near it. Said the voices taught him things." The man shrugged. "Maybe they did. Maybe that's why you killed him." She didn't flinch. "I came to burn what's left. Every stone, every curse." Jeremiah looked at her, then at the slab. "Then we start tonight." The man watched them both. "You sure you want to stir what sleeps?" Mara looked him dead in the eye. "It's been stirring in me every night since I left." They built the fire high. Jeremiah soaked the timbers in oil drawn from the smith's stores. Mara dragged dry brush and kindling until her hands bled again. The man, whose name they never asked, watched from the shadow of his forge. When the flames caught, they caught quick. The stone hissed, the iron groaned, and somewhere beneath it all, the air shivered like something waking. They stayed until dawn. The structure collapsed inward, sparks flaring against the sky like angry stars. Mara stood before the ashes, unmoving. Jeremiah stepped beside her. "You think it's done?" She shook her head. "I think it's beginning." And as the sun rose over Hellwater, painting the cliffs in red gold, neither of them turned from the fire. Because some pasts are not meant to be buried. They are meant to be burned clean. They didn't speak for a long time after the fire. Ash clung to their clothes, and the wind took the rest, scattering it over the valley like dust from an old wound. What had stood there, man, memory, ruin, was now only smoke. But Mara's shoulders stayed tight, her gaze distant, as if she still heard echoes. They left the forge behind at first light, riding north by instinct more than map. The road was no longer about escape. Not anymore. Jeremiah knew it in the way Mara moved, slower now, like the weight she'd carried in silence was shifting, not lifting. The kind of burden that changed shape but never truly left. A week out from the fire, they met a child on the edge of dry spoke wash. He couldn't have been more than 10, barefoot and hollow-eyed, crouched beside a stream that barely trickled. When he saw them, he didn't run, just stood, staring. Jeremiah dismounted, slow. "You alone, boy?" The child nodded. Mara offered a piece of jerky from her saddlebag. "What's your name?" He took the food with both hands. "Lee." "Where's your kin, Lee?" "Gone," he said between chews. "Took the wagon east. Left me when the mule broke." Mara crouched beside him, eye level. "You been waiting for them." "They said they'd send someone. That was 5 sleeps ago." The wind picked up then, and the boy shrank into himself. Jeremiah looked down the dry creek, saw nothing but vulture prints and broken wheels. Mara stood. "He rides with us now." Jeremiah didn't argue. They gave the boy a blanket, a spot near the fire each night. Mara taught him to boil pine bark for fever and listen for rattlers in the stone. She spoke to him more than she ever had to Jeremiah, voice low and steady, telling stories from a world that no longer existed. Jeremiah watched her closely, not with suspicion, but the kind of careful attention a man gives to a thing he knows might slip away. Lee didn't ask questions about where they were headed. He took Tamara's side like he'd been born into her shadow. She never told him no, never raised her voice. Only once did Jeremiah hear her speak sharp, and that was when Lee tried to kill a rabbit with a stone. "We take life when we must," she said, snatching the rock from his hand, "but never for practice, never for pride." The boy blinked, then nodded. They passed through Devil's Lantern, a ghost town long abandoned. The chapel stood roofless, its bell cracked in half and lying in the nave. Mara entered first, running her fingers along the blackened pews. She picked up a rusted hymn book, turned its pages slow. Jeremiah stayed at the door, Lee beside him. "What is this place?" the boy whispered. "Where prayers were last heard," Jeremiah said, before men stopped listening. Later that night, Lee asked if Mara was a preacher. She smiled, for the first time Jeremiah had seen. "I knew a preacher once. He told me faith was the only fire that didn't burn. I never could believe that." "You got faiths." "I have scars. They remind me where I've been. That's enough for now." By the second week, Lee began to cough. Just once, then more. At first Mara thought dust, dry wind. But by the third day, he shivered through the night, breath rattling like dry leaves. They stopped in a canyon mouth, found shelter under an outcrop. Mara brewed teas from what herbs she had left. Jeremiah rode for 2 days straight, searching for help, for a doctor, for anything. He returned with a single bottle of laudanum and word that a plague was running through the west like wildfire. "You think it's fever?" Mara asked as she wet the cloth for Lee's head. Jeremiah didn't answer, just handed her the bottle. Mara sat with the boy through each night, whispering songs and brushing sweat from his brow. She never looked away. Not when his skin turned pale, not when the blood came, not when he began calling out for a mother who never returned. On the 5th day, Lee died just before dawn. The sky was silvered with frost, and he passed without sound. Mara didn't cry. She held him until the warmth left his limbs, then wrapped him in her shawl. They buried him beneath a cottonwood tree where birds still came to nest. Jeremiah carved a marker from red cedar. Lee. A boy who waited. Mara laid one stone at its base, then stepped back. "We should keep moving," she said. Her voice was hoarse. Jeremiah loaded the horses. They rode on. That night, around a low fire, he finally spoke. "You blame yourself." She didn't look at him. "I let him believe he'd be safe. He was for a time. Not enough." Jeremiah poked at the fire with a stick. "Nothing's ever enough, Mara. That don't mean it wasn't worth something." She turned to him then, and in the flickering dark he saw the pain carved deep in her like the canyons they passed, but also the strength. The same kind that pulled children from fire, that buried the unburied, that returned to Hellwater when no one asked. "I'm tired," she whispered. He nodded. "Me too." They didn't speak again that night, but they sat closer than before. And when she leaned her head on his shoulder, he didn't move. The fire burned down to coals, and the wind moved soft through the rocks. Somewhere behind them, graves marked the way. But ahead, faint, uncertain, was still the promise of road. The weather turned on them just past the whistling arches, where the wind carved the stone into cruel curves and silence hung heavy, broken only by the cry of hawks overhead. Rain came sudden and hard, drenching the ground to clay, washing out the trail in wide smears of rust and ash. The horses labored through it, their flanks slick with mud, their eyes rolling white with each thundercrack. They found shelter in a dry cave, tucked beneath a jutting cliff like a hidden lung in the belly of the land. The fire took an hour to coax from damp wood, and still it smoked more than it burned. Mara didn't complain. She wrung out her clothes, shivered beside the flames, and stared into the dark as if trying to remember something she wasn't sure she wanted back. Jeremiah stripped down to his shirt and laid his coat near the fire to dry. Neither of them spoke for some time. They'd grown used to long silences, but this one felt weighted, like the air itself was holding its breath. Finally, she said, "I've been here before." He turned toward her. "Long time ago, after I ran. Before I knew what else I was meant for." "What happened here?" She didn't answer right away, just reached into her satchel and pulled out a small book, its leather binding cracked and warped. She handed it to him. Inside were pressed flowers. Dozens of them, dry, delicate things flattened between pages filled with faded ink. Some looked like prairie sage, others he didn't recognize. I started keeping it after I left Cinder Hollow, she said. Each flower came from a place I survived. Jeremiah turned a page slowly. A sprig of yarrow fell loose and landed on his knee. I was going to give it to the girl in Bellmare, the one in the chapel. She liked stories. I thought this might be one she could carry. He closed the book carefully and handed it back. You still carry it. I don't know why anymore, she said. Maybe it's all I have left of her. Of me. The fire popped, a single spark leaping toward the cave mouth. Outside, the storm still boiled. He looked at her then, not just at her face, but at the lines of her, the set of her shoulders, the way her hands trembled only when she thought no one noticed. She carried more than most and still stood. You know, he said quietly, they say when you walk through fire and live, it marks you, but I think the real mark is what you do with the ashes. She looked at him then, her eyes glassed with something he hadn't seen before, not sorrow, but the edge of something gentler. Hope maybe, or the possibility of it. They slept side by side that night, not touching, not yet, just near enough to feel the heat of the other. Jeremiah kept watch with his back to the storm, rifle across his lap. He listened to her breathing, steady now, and for the first time in many months, sleep came to him without dream or dread. The storm passed by morning, leaving the land washed clean. They followed the path north again, where the earth rose into high plains and the wind smelled of pine instead of salt. The air grew thin, the nights colder. Game was scarce, but water ran in rivulets from the snowmelt, cold and clear. They passed a caravan bound east, families with tired eyes, dragging the last of their world in battered wagons. One woman approached Mara, asking for medicine. Her son had fever, her husband a wound that festered. Mara didn't hesitate. She opened her satchel, tore strips from her own dress to bind wounds, gave what herbs she had left. The woman tried to offer coin. Mara refused. Later, Jeremiah asked her why. I can't save everyone, she said, but I can't stop trying. They reached the high ridge above Silverbone Valley by the end of the week. From there, the world spread wide, forests to the west, mountains to the north, and between them, a stretch of land known only in rumor. Ghost Hollow, it wasn't on any map. Jeremiah had heard stories around fires, of voices in the trees, of disappearances, of strange lights that moved like will-o'-the-wisps. Most stayed clear of it. But Mara looked down into that valley with something close to recognition. This is where they took my sister, she said. He turned sharply. You never said you had a sister. I didn't think she was real for a long time. I was small when they separated us. My memories, they got buried, but I see her now more clearly each night. I remember her voice. She touched the necklace around her neck, a simple thing, a piece of carved bone worn smooth. She wore the same. We were given them by our mother before the raids. Jeremiah waited. She's out there, Mara said. Or she was. I need to find her, even if it's only bones. Even if it's only the place she last stood. He didn't argue. He simply adjusted his rifle strap and said, Then we go. They descended into Ghost Hollow that evening, as mist curled from the pines and the sun dropped behind the peaks. The light thinned, strange and bluish, and the quiet was so complete it made their footsteps sound like thunder. No birds, no wind, just breath and the crackle of underbrush. Mara moved with purpose now, her every step a memory unfolding. Jeremiah stayed close, alert, eyes sweeping the gloom for signs, human, animal, other. At the heart of the hollow, they found it. An old stone house, half-collapsed, choked in ivy and moss. No roof, door hanging by a hinge, a place long dead. Mara entered first. There was a wooden beam near the hearth, carved with initials. She touched them gently. MW plus SW. She closed her eyes. She was here. In the corner lay a pile of weather-worn cloth, bones tangled in their threads. Small, fragile, clutched in one bony hand, a necklace twin to Mara's. She sank to her knees and did not cry, not at first. She pressed her forehead to the earth and whispered words in a language Jeremiah didn't know. Then the tears came, silent and unrelenting. Jeremiah knelt beside her, laid his hand on her back, said nothing. When she looked up, her face was raw. I was supposed to keep her safe. You were a child, he said. So was she. They buried the bones beneath the old oak outside the house, where roots drank deep and the earth still held warmth. Mara placed the necklace with her sister's remains, her own left bare. I'll carry both now, she said. And Jeremiah understood then what it meant to carry someone not just through hell, but beyond it. As they rode out of Ghost Hollow, the mist lifted, and the silence behind them no longer felt cursed, but reverent. They came down out of the hollow changed, not by the finding of bones or the whispers left behind, but by something quieter, the knowing. Myra rode straighter now, her face still drawn but not so haunted. Grief didn't leave her, but it rode beside her like an old companion instead of a shadow. Jeremiah could feel the shift in her silence, the way it no longer pressed inward. She spoke more now, though still soft, and when she looked at him, it was with a gaze that didn't flinch. They followed the river west, where the banks were soft with spring and the trees bloomed wild with color. Camps came easy, and the nights held less fear. On the 7th evening they came upon an abandoned homestead, its fence still standing, barn half collapsed. A place forgotten but not ruined, a place with a well that still gave water. They stayed 2 days, long enough to rest the horses, to mend clothes, to feel what stillness might offer. Mara spent the morning weaving a snare line from cord and bark, and Jeremiah watched her from the porch, his hands wrapped around a cup of bitter coffee. You ever think of stopping? He asked. She didn't pause. Not until now. He nodded slowly. This place could hold us a while, if we wanted. She glanced up. The wind moved through her hair, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked, not free, but unguarded. I don't know if I know how to stop, she said, but I'm willing to learn. They made a fire that night with care, not for warmth or defense, but for company. Mara brought out her old book again, turned to a blank page. She placed a sprig of mountain violet inside, pressed it gently with her palm. For Lee, she said. Jeremiah nodded, and the girl in the chapel. She looked up at him, and for the ones we still carry. Later, as the fire burned low, she reached for his hand. It was a small gesture, quiet and sure, but it hit Jeremiah harder than any gunshot. He didn't speak. He just laced his fingers with hers, and in the hush that followed, something shifted between them. Not a declaration, not a promise, just presence, the truest kind. They left the homestead on the 3rd day with no destination in mind. It wasn't aimlessness, it was trust, in the land, in time, in each other. They came upon a traveling group a few days later, 4 wagons, 3 families, a preacher with a blind left eye, and a voice like thunder. The travelers were bound for the Northwest Territories, looking for fertile ground and peace. They stopped for supper, shared beans and bannock, stories and laughter. One of the women, gray-haired and broad-shouldered, asked Mara outright, "Are you his?" Mara blinked, his. She gestured toward Jeremiah, who sat sharpening his knife by lantern light. His woman, he watches you like a man watching the last light before winter. Mara smiled, a flicker only. I don't belong to anyone. But do you belong with him? Mara looked into the fire for a long while. Then softly, yes. The woman nodded, then you've already crossed the hardest stretch. That night Jeremiah woke to find Mara sitting by the wagons, watching the sky. He joined her, shoulders brushing. You thinking of going with them? He asked. I don't know, she said. They're good people, but I think we're still looking for something. He didn't press her. The stars were out, scattered like ash across the heavens. You believe in heaven, Jeremiah? She asked after a while. I used to, he said, and now. I believe in what I can touch, in the fire, in the breath I hear when you sleep, in you. She closed her eyes. When I was a girl, I thought heaven was a gate, a place the good were called to, but now I think it's a choice. A thing you build, moment by moment, in the people you hold close. He turned toward her, and hell. She opened her eyes, hell, what you walk through alone. He didn't answer, just reached out and touched the place where her necklace had once hung. You've been walking a long time, he said. She leaned into him, head on his shoulder. Not alone anymore. They parted from the caravan come morning. The preacher gave them a pouch of seed. "For when you find your ground," he said. Mara thanked him with a nod. They traveled west still, following no road but their own. And somewhere between the broken canyons and the high meadows, they came upon a stretch of land that felt untouched by sorrow. Grass grew high and golden. A stream cut through the center, cold and clear. Wildflowers bloomed like small blessings. They looked at one another, then dismounted. "This it?" Jeremiah asked. Mara knelt in the dirt, ran her hands through it. Her face softened. "Yes," she said, "this is it." And there, without fanfare or witness, they made camp, a place to rest, a place to stay. They didn't call it heaven, but it was enough. Spring held there longer than it did in most places, as if the land had been waiting for them. The mornings came slow and silvered, mist lifting off the grass like breath, and the stream ran steady, cutting soft songs through the valley floor. Jeremiah built the fence post by post, hands calloused but sure. Mara turned the soil, her palms dark with earth, the scent of new roots clinging to her skin. Neither said aloud that they were staying, but the work made it so. They found an old cabin nearby, half collapsed under a thicket of climbing rose. Jeremiah cleared it beam by beam, while Mara gathered stones for a hearth. She lined the shelves with dried herbs and those pressed flowers from her book, each one a memory, each one a vow not to forget. A wind chime of bone and tin hung from the eave, and it sang when the wind came down from the hills. They slept beside the fire those first weeks, blankets pulled tight, boots near the door, not out of fear. Habit. You don't walk through Hellwater and shake it off like dust. Some echoes stay, but nights grew gentler, the air held less warning, and there were moments, small, sacred things, when Mara would laugh, low and sudden, or Jeremiah would catch himself humming an old hymn under his breath. Not because they'd forgotten, but because they hadn't. They met a few passers-by, trappers, wayfarers, once a Lakota woman and her child, who traded smoked fish for flour and left them a bundle of tobacco in thanks. The woman touched Mara's hand before she left, said something quiet in her own tongue. Mara closed her eyes as if it were a blessing she'd waited her whole life to hear. The seasons turned. One evening, as orange light pooled over the porch, Jeremiah came to find Mara standing at the edge of the stream, her dress caught in the current. Her hair had grown longer, shot with silver near the temples. She held something wrapped in cloth. "I found it," she said when he came near. He waited. "In the satchel, buried deep. A letter. My sister wrote it, must have hidden it when they took us." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled. "She wrote she forgave me, said if I ever made it out, I should plant something wild for her, something that would grow without asking." Jeremiah took the cloth from her hands. Inside was a handful of pale seeds. They planted them together near the bend of the stream. That night they sat on the porch, boots off, feet in the cool grass. The stars came thick and low, like they might fall any second. Mara leaned into him, warm and quiet. "I think I understand now," she said. "Understand what?" "Why heaven never called you back." He turned toward her, one brow raised. "Because you never left it behind. You carried it with you, through ash and blood and silence. You made it in every kindness, every grave you tended, every fire you kept burning." He looked down, hands folded. "I didn't save them all." "You saved me." He closed his eyes. "Mara." She reached for his hand. No words. "Just sit with me." And he did. They sat like that for a long while, until the chill came down from the hills and the crickets quieted. Then she whispered, "You remember when I asked if you had room?" He nodded. "You never asked why I needed it." He looked at her, firelight flickering in her eyes. "Didn't need to." "Well," she said, voice thick, "thank you for carrying me all that way, through Hellwater." He drew her hand to his chest, laid it there. "You weren't a burden." "I know," she said, "but I needed to hear it." Later, when the coals died down and the stream sang only to the trees, they lay side by side in the cabin they'd built, bodies close, hearts unhidden. Outside, the wildflowers bloomed where her sister rested, and the wind carried no ghosts, only the hush of peace earned, not given.